Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chat with one of our favorite guests, PRI economist Wayne Winegarden. Wayne's got a new study out on entrepreneurship and why a vibrant entrepreneurial economy is vital to improving the lives of low-income families and new immigrants. The problem is that the morass of regulations and high taxes have made it harder and harder for aspiring entrepreneurs to strike out on their own, whether it's stringent occupational licensing rules, applying for small business loans, compliance with all the red tape, and a tax system that penalizes owning your own business. It's no wonder that the small business sector of our economy is far less vibrant than it used to be. Thanks for joining us for this important issue. Welcome back to Next Round, Wayne.
Well, thanks for having me back.
Well, we're pleased to have you back to talk about the next study in PRI's Breaking Down Barriers to Opportunity series. So this study focuses on how entrepreneurship is critical for lower income Americans and recent immigrants to work their way up to the middle class and even beyond. So let's start with a 30,000-foot view question. Just how important is entrepreneurship for helping poor people and minority communities achieve the American dream?
It's really inseparable. I mean, let me come up with one statistic that I think really demonstrates the importance of this. When I came across when I was researching this paper, for quick background, I was living in New York City during 9/11, and the whole city had a really eerie feeling, afterward. And there was this exodus of jobs and people, and nobody really knew what the city would cover. And so when I was reading about the small business communities and the immigrant communities, and those parts of New York that had been creating jobs faster than the city as a whole prior to 9/11, they continued to create jobs even when the rest of the city was in economic decline, which I think that's stunning. And I think that is kind of a microcosm of how important entrepreneurship is for poor minority communities. A vibrant entrepreneurial sector, it creates opportunities for the whole community, it lifts it up. And entrepreneurs tend to invest back in their neighborhoods. So it's just an essential part of creating a sustainable and broad-based prosperity to these communities where it's just desperately needed.
Wayne, you begin your study by painting a picture of the income levels of low-income Americans over time. And looking at these government figures, you make the case that while income levels for the poor are often quite volatile, they've been improving in recent years. So share with our listeners what you found.
Oh, absolutely. I started looking into this because you can't connect kind of the impact of entrepreneurship on lower income, middle income communities unless you actually know how those communities have been performing. And we constantly hear this rhetoric on the campaign trail, that middle income families haven't had a raise for decades. And when you look at the data, that's just not correct. After you adjust for inflation, the average income for families in 2018 is at its highest level ever. One way we kind of break it down in the study, if you looked at this threshold of $50,000 a year or more, right now, 60% of families have an income that at that threshold or higher. Back in 1970, it was only about 50%. And the same thing goes when we talk about $15,000 earning threshold. That's actually not at all-time lows, but it's very close to it. So, and these figures don't even include the impact from federal support programs. So now all of this is not to say that there's not issues out there or that things need to be done, but factually, Americans are doing better off income-wise today than they ever have before.
Your 9/11 response made me think of when I was in San Francisco during 9/11, and in Chinatown, there was a huge American flag painted in the side of one of the walls there, and lots of signs that said, "Hey, come in, we're open for business." And it was very heartwarming to see that. Yeah. As you say, entrepreneurship is critical in times of recession and in our economy. So, in your study, you argue that a healthy and vibrant economic climate for entrepreneurship is critical to upward mobility of low-income Americans. What's the case? Why is ensuring that there are favorable economic policies in place to boost entrepreneurship for growing the economy and increasing opportunity?
If you talk about entrepreneurship, you're really talking about the American dream. I mean, for hundreds of years, when you talk about all the wave of immigrants or people who've been here for years, how did we lift ourselves up? And it's through either direct entrepreneurship or indirectly by being, part of an entrepreneurial venture. It's funny, when I was thinking about this study, I was there's that new movie coming out, right? The Current War, and it might be out already in theaters, where it's talking about Westinghouse versus Tesla versus Edison. I mean, these are the entrepreneurs who changed the world, right? They drove the economy forward, and literally billions of people either directly or indirectly have benefited from that entrepreneurial process. And so part of entrepreneurship is that the huge life-altering kind of companies of tomorrow kind of come from today's entrepreneurs, right? Microsoft, Amazon, Google, right? The huge companies today, but 30, 40 years ago, they were small little entrepreneurial ventures. So part of what entrepreneurship does is it kind of creates that life-altering technologies. And those get a lot of attention, and deservedly so. But there's also another side to entrepreneurship, but is just as valuable, if not more so. And that's the small entrepreneur that starts a restaurant, a landscaping company, or they're selling their wares at a local farmer's market, right? They're improving the lives of their neighbors, of the people around them, and they're demonstrating, and I think this is so important in our political environment, that the economy is not a zero-sum game, right? That by leveraging our different talents, and working together, we're improving our collective well-being. And so that, to me, is part of what's so important about entrepreneurship. And where policy fits into all of this is that economic policy either takes all of these talents and it puts it in the right direction, or it can put it in the wrong direction, or it can inhibit it. And what we've seen over time is that when the policies are supportive of entrepreneurship, we get that virtuous circle. We get the collective well-being. The bottom 15 and bottom 20% of households, their incomes are growing. And when we don't get that in the right environment, that's when we see those periods of stagnation, when the median household income was going down because the policy wasn't supportive of that positive sum game that entrepreneurship should be creating.
Let's get into some of these government-created barriers to opportunity that you talk about and the reforms that you recommend to break them down. First, let's talk about some of the policies that you would expect would be a hindrance to growing a business and creating jobs. So what are some of the most important regulatory hurdles facing small businesses and low-income entrepreneurs today, and how do they negatively impact them and economic growth?
You're talking about regulations like workers' compensation costs or occupational licensing. It's regulatory, it's red tape that increase the costs of either being an entrepreneur or actually creates a barrier to actually being able to take that opportunity in the first place. If you just look at the regulatory burden, there's this one study actually by an old professor of mine where he documented that if you're a company with less than 50 employees, your cost, the regulatory costs are about $12,000 per employee. I mean, that's just an incredible, additional cost on a business that you have to pay just to comply with regulations. That's not necessarily serving your customers. That's not paying your bills. Or, that's just dealing with the regulations of the government. That's an incredible burden, and it makes successful entrepreneurial ventures that much more difficult. But there's also, I guess, a flip side to that. I mean, take something like occupational licensing regulations, right? These are the regulations that justify based on a public safety concern, right? That, we need to make sure that our, licensed emergency medical technicians, right, that they actually know what they're doing. So that's the purpose of it. But then if it takes 11 times as much training to become a cosmetologist as a licensed emergency medical technician, which a recent study by the Institute for Justice has found, it really brings into question whether or not those licensing regulations are fulfilling or providing any value. And while they don't provide value, they create a huge obstacle. Taking 6, 9, 10 months out of your life to get a license so that you can be a cosmetologist or a hairdresser, and that for someone without a large income, if you're poor, that's just an overwhelming obstacle that's going to prevent you from getting the qualifications to open that small business. And if you somehow did get past it, finding people to work to work for you is going to be that much harder because the occupational licensing restrictions are going to just narrow down the pool.
Naturally, taxes are another big headache for small businesses and startups in California and across the country. How much do anti-opportunity tax policies add to the burdens of entrepreneurs? I was especially shocked after reading the study that only the first $400 of income was exempt from taxes. And I know it's going to be one of the reforms you'll be discussing with Tim in the next question. But first of all, how do high tax burdens create a disincentive for small businesses to hire additional employees? employees?
It's such an important question. It's really straightforward, right? The more you tax something, the less of it you get, right? And people seem to understand that logic when it kind of behooves them, and then forget it when it doesn't. But the bottom line is, when you put a high tax on entrepreneurship, you're going to get less entrepreneurship. It's just that simple. And the tax system is itself kind of biased against small businesses and startups just because of its complexity and all of the costs that it imposes. I mean, you have some studies talk about, like, if it's a small firm to 1 to 5 employees, $4,000 of tax costs of complying with the tax code per employee. I mean, that's just a tremendous cost. And so, it makes the after-tax income, one, makes it less worth it to engage in the entrepreneurial venture, and it makes the success rate of the ventures that much smaller.
So as Ro just mentioned, one reform that you propose is raising the threshold for small business payroll taxes. So how would this reform help entrepreneurs and put more money in their pockets to invest in growing their businesses and creating new jobs?
It helps because, precisely because it puts more money in their pockets. This kind of gets into the complexity of the tax code, right? But right now, payroll taxes, right, they're the taxes we pay to fund Social Security and Medicare. And right now, if you work for a company, right, your employer pays half of it, 7.65, and you pay the other half. But if you're self-employed, now you're responsible for that whole 15.3% up to the income limit. Now, there's a $400 exemption from the payroll tax in the first $400 of income. Why 400? That's the amount that was set in the Self-Employment Contributions Act of 1954. And so, kind of the idea that I was trying to raise in the paper is that a lot has changed since 1954, and if the exemption was a good idea because it's supposed to give breathing room to low-income entrepreneurs, and I truly believe that's a valuable goal and something that it's an important idea, then this amount needs to be updated. I mean, the amount that was appropriate in 1954 is just inappropriate for today. And there's lots of ways to update the figure, but if you take as a basis that standard deduction that everybody's familiar with on the 1040, and you kind of take that growth in the standard deduction and say that $400 deduction should have grown by the same amount, then you're talking about $8,700 of income. The first $8,700 of income should be exempt from the payroll tax, and that puts over $1,300 of income directly into an entrepreneur's pocket. And that, especially for a low-income entrepreneur, is a meaningful difference that as you're kind of trying to get past that valley of death, you're trying to get the business up and running, an extra $1,300 a year is meaningful.
We hear a lot on the presidential campaign trail about how expensive healthcare is for employers, especially small businesses. You propose reforming the tax laws to make it more affordable for employers to afford both employee healthcare costs and retirement costs. Explain your proposal and how it would help entrepreneurs.
This is something I spent a lot of time trying to kind of go through and identifying what are the obstacles, like the competitive obstacles, as well as kind of the regulatory complexities that just make it harder to be a small business. And everyone's aware of the complexity of the tax code. And often that complexity arises because the government's trying to help a certain group. And often those are small businesses. But the problem is that now that complexity is creating more problems than the solution it's trying to offer. And so, kind of taking that logic, if you look at the other problem the small businesses face, right, which is how can they be competitive with a large company that has a whole benefits department and all of these kind of perks that they have a hard time competing with. If we take all of that together, how can we make small businesses life easier and make them more competitive as an employer compared to large businesses? That's kind of where the idea came from. And the idea is, what if we simplify all of these tax-free accounts? And so we had one tax-free account that could be used to fund healthcare, used to fund their retirement, so that if you don't spend the money on healthcare in a current year, that can roll over. Maybe it's a health expenditure next year, maybe it rolls over and into retirement. Make that portable, make it so both the employer and the employee can donate to that account, right? And make those limits high enough so that they're meaningful contributions. The amount that we recommended should be put in there for retirement to cover the full cost of health insurance as well as the out-of-pocket expenditures. Now we have a simple tax-free account that's very valuable for the employees, and it's portable, so it goes with them no matter where they go. For the entrepreneur themselves, they have a meaningful way to cover their family's healthcare costs and to save for their retirement. And And again, it's simpler for them to implement and to manage, as opposed to having to have all of these different accounts with all of these different kind of restrictions and requirements, and having to fund healthcare and pay for the healthcare insurance. And these accounts, by the way, would also have important benefits in healthcare reform and in kind of solving our retirement crisis. But we're talking about this from the small business perspective, not from healthcare reform.
Another issue that you bring up is lack of access to credit and capital, which really makes it very difficult for the low-income and immigrant entrepreneurs that we're talking about from getting the money that they need to fund their startups and get their businesses off the ground. So talk about these poor government policies and the thinking behind them.
There's several problems that when you talk to small businesses, they always are putting out there as, these are the obstacles we have to deal with. Taxes, regulations are always up there. Credit availability, especially for smaller firms, is that constant nagging problem. Having access to the loans and the credits they need to, even if it's a good idea, even if it's going to make it, if you don't have that liquidity managed, that could sink an otherwise viable company. So that's a constant threat that's out there. And so what we've actually seen, unfortunately, is that financial regulations become kind of a problem for the lenders that actually are the ones that provide the credit to small businesses. So there's this indirect connection where you're cutting off the lifeblood of the businesses through these financial regulations. The biggest example, and this has actually been partly resolved already, has been Dodd-Frank, right? Dodd-Frank are the regulations that came out of the mortgage meltdown in 2008, the financial crisis. And so these were supposed to be addressing the problems that came from the large banks, so to speak. But what ended up happening is they imposed these excessive costs on the community bank. Now, these community banks, they're the smaller banks, the major lenders to small businesses. And in fact, because those regulations is kind of a direct parallel to what we've been talking about, because those regulations are more burdensome on the smaller bank, they basically pulled back and started effectively shrinking, which, since they were the ones that lent to the small businesses, that meant you had a shrinking in the credit availability to small businesses. And you got, as opposed to a virtuous circle, you got this vicious circle, which kind of was restricting credit even more. Now, there's good news in this story, because in 2018, there was bipartisan legislation which repealed some of the most onerous parts of the Dodd-Frank regulations for these community banks. And so hopefully we're going to see the community banks' assets grow and they'll become able to lend to small businesses more. But there's also a parallel to this, because even within those small bank loans, often those are too large for some of the smallest businesses. And so now what we get into is what they call microcredit, or the loans less than $250,000, which is typically too small for most business loans, but it's what a small business needs. And so now we have micro lenders that are emerging, and this is a really exciting part of the industry. But again, there's issues of, well, these are currently being unregulated, and so regulations are being proposed, and so we need to regulate these firms very lightly, make sure that it's simple, transparent, in order to foster these micro credit businesses, which could be a very, very valuable part of this small business ecosystem to help these companies overcome that kind of constant credit constraint problem.
Finally, let's close with a discussion of a huge issue in California this year that has the potential to significantly affect entrepreneurs, and that's Assembly Bill 5. AB 5 imposes strict new restrictions on who is an employee in California and who's an independent contractor. In your view, how would AB 5 affect low-income entrepreneurs trying to be their own boss and working their way up the economic ladder?
Before getting into that, I've just got to make, AB 5 is just terrible policy. I mean, it's just the height of arrogance, right? I mean, it's these legislators in Sacramento basically declaring, we know what economic arrangements are going to benefit people the most. And so we're going to tell you that you may think you want to be an independent contractor, but that's not what you want. And, so just that arrogance, I find, is often the kind of the first step towards really bad policy that is going to have huge economic consequences, across the board. If we're going to talk about small businesses, right, if you go back to kind of the themes that we've been talking about so far, this is just another example of that, where it's going to be a regulation that's going to impose larger costs on small businesses, because the flexibility that the gig economy, which is really what you're almost outlawing, provides to small businesses, is being legislated away. That you can't have someone hired as an independent contractor, even if that's a more preferred situation for the person that's going to be working for you, even if that's a more preferred way or less risky way for the business to hire them, we're going to outlaw that, not let you do it. And there's also an indirect indirect issue too, because of the gig economy, right? People going from gig to gig to gig. A lot of these independent contractors are in effect trying to be small businesses, and this may be a way that they can start to bootstrap themselves into a sustainable business. And so you're cutting off that path for entrepreneurship, where as opposed to kind of amassing together a bunch of gigs that they can turn into a business, you're saying you're either an employee or you're unemployed. And so you're limiting business growth, you're limiting economic freedom, and when you do those things, you're going to diminish the vibrancy both of the small business community in the state as well as broader state growth trend.
Well, we hope in the long run that this bill will be overturned through ballot initiative. We've have hearing some discussions about that might happening, or even at a minimum some fixes to AB 5 next year, because it has a lot of businesses up in arms. So thanks so much. It's been a great discussion, and we look forward to getting out the new study. Thanks, Wayne.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Special thanks to our guest Wayne Winegarden and to my colleague Tim Anaya. You can find Wayne's study, Breaking Barriers to Opportunity, at Pacific Research Institute's website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.